The candlelight flickers across parchment as your trembling hand forms what you know will be your final words. The scratch of quill against paper marking time until dawn brings the executioner's axe to your neck. Quick favour, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. This moment would reshape the course of European politics, ignite religious wars, and transform a captive queen into a martyr whose death would haunt the Protestant world for generations. The evening of February 7th, 1587, settled like a shroud over Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. Mary Stuart, once Queen of Scots, now 44 years old and ravaged by nearly 2 decades of English imprisonment, received the news she had both dreaded and anticipated. Tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock precisely, she would meet her death on the scaffold. The messenger's words hung in the cold air of her chamber like smoke from snuffed candles, final and irreversible. But Mary did not weep. She did not rage against the injustice or beg for mercy from her cousin Elizabeth's representatives. Instead, she moved with the calculated precision of a woman who had spent 19 years preparing for this moment. Her arthritic fingers, swollen and aching from the damp English climate, reached for her writing materials with surprising steadiness. The Queen who had lost 3 kingdoms would not lose her dignity. The letter she began to Henri III of France would become one of history's most poignant final communications. Tonight, after dinner, I have been advised of my sentence, she wrote in her elegant script, each word carefully chosen to convey both her acceptance of fate and her unwavering faith. Yet beneath the composed exterior, what thoughts tormented her mind as she set down these words that would outlive her by centuries? Around her, the carefully controlled chaos of final preparations began. Elizabeth Curl and Jane Kennedy, her most faithful attendants, moved through the chamber with quiet efficiency, their faces masks of controlled grief. These women had shared Mary's captivity, witnessed her slow physical decline, and now they would help her prepare for death with the same devotion they had shown in life. Mary's personal physician, Dominique Bourgoing, checked and rechecked his medical supplies, perhaps hoping against hope for a reprieve that would never come. The Queen's movements that night revealed a woman transformed by suffering into something approaching serenity. The chronic pain in her right side, which had plagued her writing for years, seemed momentarily forgotten as she distributed her precious possessions among her servants. A prayer book here, a piece of jewellery there, each gift carrying the weight of memory and affection. Her hands, twisted by arthritis that had worsened dramatically during her captivity, handled each item with tender care. What had brought her to this frozen moment in time? The path from Scottish queen to English prisoner to condemned traitor stretched back through decades of political miscalculation, religious warfare, and the deadly game of succession politics that had consumed the Tudor era. Mary's very existence had challenged Elizabeth's legitimacy from the moment of her birth, and now that challenge would be answered with steel. As midnight approached, Mary turned to her final spiritual preparations. Denied the comfort of a Catholic priest, she faced her last hours on earth with only her personal faith and the Latin prayers she had memorized as a child. The irony was bitter. A woman who had once commanded the loyalty of Catholic Europe now knelt alone in a Protestant stronghold, preparing to meet her Maker without the sacraments her faith demanded. Her lips moved silently in the ancient words, while outside her chamber, the scaffolding in the great hall stood ready, draped in black cloth like a funeral shroud. But how had Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen who prided herself on clemency, finally been driven to sign her cousin's death warrant? The answer lay tangled in webs of espionage, cipher codes, and a conspiracy that would seal Mary's fate with her own hand. The Babington plot had ensnared the Scottish Queen in treason charges that even her royal blood could not wash away, and now the consequences approached with the inexorable certainty of sunrise. As Mary's final night dissolved into the grey pre-dawn hours of February 8th, 1587, the executioners were already sharpening their axe in preparation for the bloodiest spectacle English politics had witnessed in decades. The great hall echoes with the sound of hammering, as workmen make final adjustments to your scaffold, each blow of the mallet driving home the reality that in less than an hour, this makeshift stage will witness your beheading. This moment would test whether a queen could die with the same grace she had once lived, transforming a political execution into a masterclass in royal dignity that would inspire Catholic martyrs for generations. The dawn light of February 8th crept through the tall windows of Fotheringhay Castle's great hall, illuminating a scene that resembled a macabre theatre more than a place of justice. Black cloth draped every surface, transforming the once grand space into a chamber of death. 3 stools stood, arranged with mathematical precision, one for each of the presiding earls, and a third for the executioner's grisly tools. At the centre, raised slightly above the floor, sat the wooden block that would soon cradle Mary's neck, its surface worn smooth by the castle's carpenter who had worked through the night to ensure a clean cut. The crowd began gathering before dawn. Hundreds of witnesses pressed into the hall, their breath creating clouds of vapour in the cold morning air. The Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent took their positions with solemn ceremony, their faces masks of official duty that barely concealed their discomfort with the proceedings. These were men who had known Mary during her captivity, who had perhaps even felt sympathy for her plight, yet now they must oversee her destruction in the name of English security. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open. Mary Stuart entered, flanked by her small retinue of faithful servants. Andrew Melville, her steward, whose weathered face showed every year of shared exile. Dominic Bourgoing, the physician who attended her failing body through countless nights of pain. Jacques Gervais, her surgeon, and Pierre Gorion, her apothecary. These men had become her chosen family through 19 years of imprisonment, and now they would witness her final performance as a queen. The transformation in Mary's bearing was remarkable. Gone was the frail, arthritic woman who had struggled with her correspondence the night before. In her place walked a figure of regal composure, her back straight despite the chronic pain that had plagued her for years. She wore a black velvet gown trimmed with black satin, its sombre elegance befitting both mourning and majesty. Around her neck hung the Agnus Dei, the sacred Catholic medallion that proclaimed her faith even in this Protestant stronghold. But what struck the assembled witnesses most powerfully was Mary's face. Where they had expected to see terror or desperation, they found instead an expression of almost supernatural calm. Her dark eyes, still beautiful despite her 44 years, surveyed the scene with the detached interest of a queen reviewing her troops. Had her 19 years of captivity somehow prepared her for this ultimate trial, teaching her to find strength in surrender? The Dean of Peterborough stepped forward, his Protestant robes rustling against the stone floor. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed hall, "I have come to prepare your soul for the journey ahead, to guide you toward the true faith before you meet your Maker." Mary's response cut through the morning air with crystalline clarity. "I am settled in the ancient Catholic Roman religion, and mind to spend my blood in defense of it." The rejection was absolute, delivered without anger or fear, simply the final declaration of a woman who would not compromise her beliefs, even at the moment of death. Instead, Mary knelt on the cold stone floor and began to pray in Latin, her voice rising and falling in the ancient rhythms that had comforted Catholic souls for over 1,000 years. The crucifix in her hands caught the wan morning light as she lifted it toward heaven, and for a moment, the assembled crowd seemed to witness something approaching the sacred. How many of these Protestant witnesses found themselves moved despite their religious convictions by this display of unwavering faith? The executioner approached, his face hidden behind a black mask that made him appear more spectre than man. Following ancient custom, he knelt before Mary and begged her forgiveness for the act he was about to perform. Her response would echo through history. "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." The words carried no bitterness, no recrimination, only the weary relief of a soul preparing for release. Mary's attendants moved forward to help her disrobe, their hands shaking as they unfastened the black gown that had concealed her final defiant gesture. Beneath the sombre outer garments, she wore a crimson petticoat and matching sleeves, the traditional colour of Catholic martyrdom, a silent proclamation that this was not merely an execution but a sacrifice for faith. As Mary knelt at the block, positioning her neck with careful precision, the executioner raised his axe for the first time, and the great hall held its collective breath, waiting for the blow that would end the most controversial royal life of the 16th century. The executioner's axe whistles through the morning air, but instead of the clean death you expected, the blade bites deep into the back of your skull, sending shockwaves of agony through your final moments. This bungled execution would become one of history's most horrifying spectacles, transforming what should have been a swift political solution into a gruesome tableau that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. The first blow fell at 8:09 on that February morning, and immediately the carefully orchestrated dignity of the proceedings collapsed into chaos. The executioner, perhaps unnerved by the weight of his task or simply lacking the skill required for such a momentous beheading, brought his axe down at the wrong angle. Instead of the clean severing strike that would have ended Mary's life in an instant, The blade struck the back of her head with a sickening thud that echoed through the great hall like a carpenter's mallet hitting green wood. Mary's body convulsed violently on the block, her hands gripping the wooden edges with desperate strength as pain exploded through her consciousness. The witnesses, who had steeled themselves for a swift and solemn execution, now found themselves spectators to a butchery that would have been shocking in a slaughterhouse, let alone in the presence of royalty. Several courtiers turned away in horror, while others stood transfixed by the awful spectacle unfolding before them. The executioner, realizing his terrible error, raised the axe again with hands that now trembled visibly. His second strike landed closer to its intended target, the blade cutting deep into Mary's neck but failing to complete the severance. Blood sprayed across the black-draped scaffold, spattering the executioner's robes and pooling on the wooden platform beneath. Mary's body continued to twitch and struggle, caught between life and death in a prolonged agony that no human being should endure. What thoughts passed through Mary's mind during these eternal seconds of suffering? Contemporary accounts suggest that even in her torment she continued to mouth her final prayer. In Manus tuas, Domine commendo spiritum meum, into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. The same words Christ had spoken on the cross now formed on the lips of a dying queen, her faith unwavering even as her body was brutalized by incompetent steel. The third blow finally completed what should have been accomplished with one swift stroke. The axe severed the remaining sinew and bone, and Mary's head separated from her shoulders with a wet, final sound that would haunt the executioner's dreams until his own death. The assembled crowd released a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding, but their relief was premature. The horror was far from over. As was customary, the executioner bent to lift the severed head by its hair, intending to display it to the witnesses as proof that justice had been served. But as his blood-slicked fingers grasped what he assumed were Mary's auburn locks, the elaborate wig slipped away, revealing the shocking reality beneath. The head that tumbled back toward the scaffold belonged to a woman far older and more frail than the regal figure who had entered the hall that morning. Mary's natural hair, revealed now for the first time in years, was short, sparse, and iron grey, the hair of a woman aged beyond her years by captivity and suffering. The most disturbing sight was yet to come. Multiple witnesses later swore that Mary's lips continued to move for a full quarter hour after the beheading, forming what appeared to be silent prayers. Medical knowledge of the time could not explain this phenomenon, leading many to interpret it as a divine sign of Mary's righteousness. Modern understanding suggests the movement was likely caused by residual nerve activity, but for those who witnessed it, the sight of a severed head, apparently continuing to pray, created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would influence their testimony for decades to come. Then, as if the morning had not provided enough shocking revelations, a small figure emerged from beneath Mary's crimson skirts. A tiny spaniel, the Queen's beloved companion, had hidden among her undergarments, and now appeared, whimpering and confused, his coat matted with his mistress's blood. The sight of this small creature, loyal to the end, searching desperately for comfort from a woman who could no longer provide it, broke the emotional dam that had held back the crowd's reaction. But even as witnesses wept at this final, heartbreaking detail, the machinery of royal justice continued its grim work, determined to erase every trace of the woman who had challenged Elizabeth's throne for nearly 3 decades. The fire roars to life in the castle fireplace, as servants frantically feed Mary's blood-soaked garments into the flames, desperate to destroy every thread that might become a sacred relic in Catholic hands. This desperate attempt to erase all physical traces of Mary's martyrdom would backfire spectacularly, as the very act of destruction would fuel legends that would inspire Catholic resistance across Europe for generations. The Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle had been transformed from execution chamber to crime scene in the space of minutes. Where moments before, hundreds of witnesses had watched the grisly finale of Mary Stuart's life, now only a select few officials remained to oversee the most sensitive phase of the entire operation, the complete obliteration of any evidence that might transform a political execution into a religious pilgrimage. Robert Beale, the clerk who had read Mary's death warrant with such official precision, now directed the clean-up with military efficiency. Every drop of blood, every fragment of bone, every splinter from the executioner's block had to be accounted for and destroyed. The Protestant authorities understood with chilling clarity that they were not merely disposing of a corpse, but attempting to prevent the birth of a legend that could threaten England's religious settlement for decades to come. The blood-stained scaffold planks were torn up and thrown into the roaring fireplace, where they hissed and crackled as the flames consumed wood that had been sanctified by royal blood. Mary's outer garments followed the black velvet gown, the white linen. Even her shoes and stockings were reduced to ash and smoke that rose up the chimney and disappeared into the February sky. But it was the crimson petticoat and sleeves, those deliberate symbols of Catholic martyrdom, that the officials destroyed with particular determination. Yet even as the flames devoured the physical evidence, the psychological impact of what had just occurred was spreading through the castle like ripples on a pond. The executioner himself, his hands still trembling from the botched beheading, sat in a corner of the great hall, staring at his bloodied axe as if it had betrayed him. His name would be lost to history, but his incompetence had ensured that Mary's death would be remembered not as swift justice but as prolonged agony, exactly the kind of detail that creates martyrs. The small spaniel that had emerged from Mary's skirts presented an unexpected problem. The dog, still whimpering and searching for his mistress, had to be captured and cleaned before he could spread the scent and stains of royal blood throughout the castle. Some accounts suggest the animal was quietly put to death to prevent any possibility of it becoming a living relic, though other sources claim he was adopted by castle staff who took pity on the creature's obvious distress. Dr. Dominique Bourgoin, Mary's physician, found himself in an impossible position. For nearly 2 decades he had tended to the Queen's failing health, documenting her arthritis, her chronic pain, her gradual physical deterioration under the harsh conditions of English captivity. Now he was ordered to prepare her body for autopsy and embalming, transforming from healer to mortician in the space of an afternoon. His medical notes from this period, should they have survived, would have provided invaluable insight into the physical toll of Mary's imprisonment. The autopsy itself revealed the extent to which captivity had ravaged Mary's body. Her internal organs showed the damage of chronic stress and inadequate medical care. The arthritis that had made writing painful in her final years had spread throughout her joints, while her digestive system bore evidence of the gastric ulcers that had plagued her for years. Most telling were her heart and lungs, which showed the strain of nearly 2 decades spent in damp, poorly heated English castles, far from the Scottish Highlands where she had been born to rule. But why had Elizabeth Tudor's government gone to such extraordinary lengths to destroy every trace of Mary's physical presence? The answer lay in the dangerous precedent of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose murder in 1170 had transformed him from political opponent into saint. Within years of Becket's death, Canterbury Cathedral had become one of Europe's most important pilgrimage sites, with the martyr's blood-stained stones working supposed miracles and drawing thousands of faithful visitors who brought both spiritual devotion and considerable wealth to the shrine. Elizabeth's advisors were determined that Fotheringhay Castle would never become a Catholic Canterbury. Every fragment of Mary's execution had to be eliminated before word of her death could spread beyond the castle walls. The very thoroughness of their efforts, however, would prove counterproductive. When news of the execution finally broke across Europe, the suspicious absence of any physical evidence would fuel speculation that Mary's death had been particularly brutal or that supernatural forces had spirited away her remains. As evening fell on February 8, 1587, the last smoke from the destruction of Mary's possessions drifted away on the winter wind, but the political firestorm her death would ignite was only beginning to smoulder across the courts of Europe. The messenger's horse pounds through the muddy February roads toward London, carrying news that will shatter Elizabeth Tudor's carefully constructed world and transform her from triumphant queen into haunted executioner. This moment would reveal the terrible cost of political necessity, as Elizabeth discovered that ordering a death and living with its consequences were 2 entirely different forms of torment. The news of Mary's execution reached Greenwich Palace on February 9th, carried by a mud-splattered courier whose horse had been ridden nearly to death in the race to deliver word to Elizabeth Tudor. The Queen was in her private chambers when Robert Carey burst through the doors with the dispatch from Fotheringhay, his face pale with the knowledge that he carried tidings that would change the course of European history. Elizabeth's initial reaction, witnessed by only her closest ladies-in-waiting, was neither relief nor satisfaction but something approaching horror. According to contemporary accounts, Elizabeth's first words upon hearing of Mary's death were not of triumph but of denial. "I never intended this." The woman who had signed the death warrant with her own hand now recoiled from the reality of what that signature had accomplished. She had spent weeks agonizing over the decision, weighing the political necessity against the moral implications of executing another anointed queen. Now, faced with the irreversible consequences of her choice, Elizabeth experienced what can only be described as a complete emotional collapse. The Queen's rage, when it finally erupted, was directed not at Mary's supporters or Catholic enemies, but at her own advisers who had carried out her written orders too efficiently. William Davison, the secretary who had delivered the death warrant to Fotheringhay, found himself summoned to court and immediately arrested. Elizabeth's fury at Davison was both genuine and calculated. She needed a scapegoat to deflect responsibility from herself, and the unfortunate secretary provided the perfect target. Within days, Davison found himself imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where Mary herself had once been held. The Star Chamber imposed a crushing fine of 10,000 marks, a sum so enormous it would bankrupt most nobles. But Davison's financial ruin was nothing compared to the psychological warfare Elizabeth waged against him, alternately threatening execution and promising forgiveness, keeping him suspended in legal limbo as a living reminder of her own internal torment. Yet even as Elizabeth publicly raged against her subordinates, she was frantically composing letters to foreign courts attempting to distance herself from Mary's death. Her correspondence to James VI of Scotland, written just 6 days after the execution, represents one of history's most remarkable displays of royal duplicity. "I would you knew, my dear brother," she wrote to Mary's son, "that it was not my meaning, but altogether against my will, that this should have happened." How could a woman who had deliberated for months over the death warrant now claim complete ignorance of its implementation? The speed with which news of the execution spread across Europe revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks that connected 16th century courts. Within weeks, detailed pamphlets describing Mary's death were being printed and distributed from London to Rome, each version shaped by the religious and political sympathies of its authors. The Magdeburg account, published in 1588, presented Mary as a Catholic saint whose blood had been shed by Protestant heretics, while English versions emphasized the legal justification for executing a convicted traitor. Roger Aston, tasked with breaking the news to James in Edinburgh, faced one of diplomacy's most delicate missions. How do you tell a king that his mother has been executed by his most important ally? Aston's approach was masterful in its calculated ambiguity. He presented the execution as the unfortunate result of overzealous officials acting beyond their authority, carefully preserving Elizabeth's plausible deniability while acknowledging the stark political reality. James's reaction defied everyone's expectations. Rather than declaring war or breaking diplomatic relations with England, the young Scottish king chose pragmatism over filial duty. His mother's death, while personally devastating, actually strengthened his position as Elizabeth's likely heir. A living Mary had always represented an alternative claimant to the English throne. A dead Mary transformed James from potential rival into grieving son, deserving of sympathy and eventual succession. But not everyone in Scotland accepted James's measured response. Edinburgh's streets filled with angry crowds posting libels, inflammatory broadsides denouncing both Elizabeth as a murderess and James as a weak son who valued English gold above his mother's blood. These popular demonstrations revealed the depth of feeling Mary's execution had stirred among ordinary Scots, even those who had never supported her political cause. As winter turned to spring in 1587, one question dominated every European court. Would Mary's death mark the end of Catholic challenges to Protestant England, or would her martyrdom inspire an even more dangerous wave of religious warfare? The physician's knife cuts through Mary's abdomen, revealing the internal devastation that 19 years of English captivity have wrought upon organs that once sustained a queen's ambitions. This grisly autopsy would expose not just the physical toll of imprisonment, but provide the medical evidence that would fuel centuries of debate about whether Mary had been slowly murdered by calculated neglect. Dr. Dominique Bourgoing approached Mary's corpse with hands that had tended her living flesh for over a decade, now forced to explore the secrets her dead body might reveal. The autopsy, conducted in a hastily cleared chamber within Fotheringhay Castle, proceeded under the watchful eyes of English officials, who understood that even Mary's internal organs might become evidence in the propaganda war already brewing across Europe. The first incision revealed what Bourgoing had long suspected, but could never definitively prove during Mary's lifetime. Her liver, grossly enlarged and bearing the telltale signs of chronic disease, showed the damage of years spent in damp, poorly ventilated English castles. The organ that should have been firm and healthy was instead mottled with discoloration, its surface scarred by what modern medicine would recognize as the effects of prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition. Mary's heart, when Bourgoing finally exposed it, told an even more damning story. The muscle was enlarged, its chambers dilated from the strain of pumping blood through a body racked by chronic inflammation. The physician's trained eye could read the evidence like a medical manuscript. Here was a woman whose cardiovascular system had been pushed beyond its limits, by the relentless pressure of captivity, uncertainty, and fear. But it was Mary's joints that provided the most shocking revelations. The arthritis that had made her final years so painful extended throughout her skeletal system, with her spine showing severe deterioration that would have caused constant agony. Her hip and knee joints were eroded to the point where walking must have been excruciating, yet she had maintained her regal bearing until the very moment she knelt at the executioner's block. How had she summoned the strength to face her final morning with such composure when every step toward the scaffold must have sent fire through her bones? The embalming process itself presented unique challenges that reflected both the political sensitivity of Mary's remains and the primitive nature of 16th century preservation techniques. Her internal organs, once removed and examined, were buried within the castle walls, a practical decision that would later fuel conspiracy theories about hidden Catholic relics. The body cavity was filled with aromatic herbs and preservatives, transforming Mary from living woman to preserved artifact in the space of hours. Yet even as medical procedures proceeded with clinical efficiency, the political implications of Mary's death were spiraling beyond anyone's control. Elizabeth's government faced the delicate task of providing Mary with a funeral, elaborate enough to honour royal protocol while avoiding any ceremonies that might inflame Catholic sentiment. The solution they devised would satisfy neither requirement effectively. The delay between Mary's death in February and her funeral in August reflected the complexity of these arrangements. For 6 months, her embalmed body remained at Fotheringhay while officials debated every detail of the ceremony. Should she be buried as a traitor or as a queen? Which nobles should attend? What religious rites would be permitted? Each decision carried the potential to either inflame or pacify the religious tensions already threatening to tear England apart. When the funeral procession finally departed Fotheringhay for Peterborough Cathedral on August 1st, it represented a masterpiece of political choreography designed to honour Mary's royal blood, while emphasising her subordination to English authority. The Bishop of Lincoln preached a sermon that walked the impossible line between acknowledging Mary's suffering and justifying her execution. His words, carefully crafted by Elizabeth's advisors, portrayed Mary as a tragic figure whose death had been necessary for England's security. The most poignant element of the funeral procession was the inclusion of over 100 poor women dressed in black gowns and white head coverings. This detail, seemingly minor, actually represented a profound statement about Mary's legacy. These were not the noble ladies who had once attended her court, but ordinary English women, whose presence suggested that Mary's story belonged not to the aristocratic world of European politics, but to the broader human experience of suffering and mortality. But even as Mary's body was laid to rest in Peterborough Cathedral's stone embrace, the most remarkable chapter of her post-mortem story was yet to be written, as her son would orchestrate a final, extraordinary act of filial devotion that would transform his mother from executed traitor into honoured ancestor. 25 years after your mother's execution, you stand before Westminster Abbey's altar, finally ready to transform her from executed traitor into honoured queen through the ultimate act of royal rehabilitation. This extraordinary reburial would complete one of history's most remarkable transformations, as James I used marble and ceremony to rewrite his mother's legacy from Catholic conspirator to martyred monarch, forever altering how posterity would remember Mary Stuart. The year 1612 marked a turning point in the Stuart dynasty's relationship with its own bloody history. James I, now firmly established on Elizabeth's throne and father to the future Charles I, had spent a quarter-century contemplating his mother's legacy and his own complicity in her fate. The pragmatic young king who had accepted Mary's execution for political advantage had matured into a monarch secure enough to honour the woman whose death had paved his path to power. The decision to move Mary's remains from Peterborough Cathedral to Westminster Abbey represented far more than filial sentiment. It was a calculated act of dynastic propaganda, designed to legitimise Stuart rule over England. By placing his mother's tomb in the same sacred space that housed English royalty going back centuries, James was asserting that the Scots had not conquered England, but had rightfully inherited it through blood and divine providence. The physical transfer of Mary's remains on October 11th, 1612, proceeded with elaborate ceremony that deliberately echoed royal coronations rather than simple reinterments. James commissioned Cornelius and William Cure, master sculptors whose work adorned England's greatest houses, to create a monument that would rival any tomb in Christendom. The result was a masterpiece of marble craftsmanship that transformed Mary from historical footnote into architectural immortality. The tomb's location within Westminster Abbey carried profound symbolic weight, James ordered it positioned in the south aisle of Henry VII's Lady Chapel, directly opposite the future resting place of Elizabeth I. This placement ensured that the two queens who had dominated 16th century politics would face each other for eternity, their earthly rivalry transformed into marble dialogue across the sacred space of England's coronation church. Mary's effigy, carved with exquisite attention to detail, depicted her not as the arthritic, pain-racked woman who had died at Fotheringhay, but as she had appeared in her prime, beautiful, regal, and serene. The sculptors erased every trace of her suffering, creating instead an idealized vision of queenship that bore little resemblance to the woman who had stumbled toward the executioner's block with swollen joints and grey hair. But why did James choose to memorialize the myth rather than the reality of his mother's final years? The elaborate canopy that crowned Mary's tomb represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of funerary architecture in 17th century Europe. Rising nearly 20 feet above the marble effigy, the structure combined Gothic revival elements with Renaissance decorative motifs, creating a visual statement about the continuity between medieval Catholic tradition and Protestant Stuart rule. Every carved detail reinforced the message that Mary belonged not among executed traitors, but among England's honoured dead. Yet even as James orchestrated this magnificent rehabilitation, Mary's original burial site at Peterborough Cathedral retained its own dark fascination. Local legends claimed that strange lights appeared around her former tomb on the anniversary of her death, while Catholic pilgrims continued to visit the site despite official discouragement. The very effort to erase Mary's presence from Peterborough seemed to enhance her supernatural reputation among those who viewed her as a martyr rather than a traitor. The international reaction to Mary's reburial revealed how completely European politics had shifted since 1587. Catholic powers that had once called for Elizabeth's excommunication now sent congratulatory messages to James for honouring his mother's memory. The papacy itself, which had spent decades plotting Elizabeth's overthrow, praised the Stuart king for his filial devotion. Religious warfare had given way to diplomatic pragmatism, and Mary's tomb became a symbol of reconciliation rather than division. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mary's posthumous transformation was how it affected popular memory of her execution. The gruesome details of that February morning at Fotheringhay, the botched beheading, the moving lips, the hidden dog gradually gave way to romanticized narratives of noble suffering and royal dignity. Artists and writers across Europe began depicting Mary's death not as the elimination of a political threat, but as the sacrifice of an innocent woman on the altar of Protestant ambition. The opening of Mary's vault during 19th century renovations provided the final confirmation of James's success in rewriting history. Workers found her remains carefully arranged within an elaborate lead coffin, surrounded by the aromatic herbs that had preserved her body for over 2 centuries. Unlike the hasty disposal of her possessions after execution, everything about Mary's Westminster tomb spoke of reverence, permanence, and royal honour. Today, visitors to Westminster Abbey encounter Mary Stuart not as the conspirator who plotted Elizabeth's assassination, but as the martyred queen whose magnificent tomb proclaims her innocence to eternity, a testament to the power of architecture and ceremony to transform even the most controversial legacy into enduring legend.